today's Q&A. So, the ball's in your court. Yeah. Yeah, okay.
So someone sent me a question. In the book of Shoftim, there are at least two examples emphasizing characters' right and left sides, and specifically grasping a weapon with their right or left hands. Is there a Kabbalistic meaning behind this?
So I'm beyond the 5 books of Moses. I'm dreadfully ignorant of the rest of the Tanach. I never studied it carefully. Certainly not the book of Shoftim, but right and left definitely are Kabbalistic ideas. Right signifies loving kindness, and left signifies strict judgment and strict justice. And although they are both divine modes of action, they're not at all equal. Loving kindness is the source of the creation, the source of the meaning of the world and its goal. And strict judgment and strict justice, like every other principle of divine action, is a derivative of loving kindness. Everything is motivated only by loving kindness. The whole Sefer, the way of God, Belutzato, is based on this premise, and the Sefer, if you look into it in detail with a little bit of nuance, the whole Sefer is just acting out that premise, showing how everything in history and everything in human psychology and everything in politics and economics and everything that we know about the physical world, all of it is an expression of loving kindness. So always left is secondary to right. Always left is a tool of the right. Always left is only a way of expressing a means to be able to achieve what the right wants. It has no independent status. Yeah.
So I tried to look and see an example what he was talking about. I just Googled quickly,
Mm-hmm.
and it brought up something like when I forgot his name, he went to kill the fat king. His right hand, it wasn't as good as his left hand, so he had the sheaf in his right hand, in his right side, and this way he was able to sneak in kind of, and then pull out with his left hand to stab. Would you say even in that case where it's a physical reason why he's not using his right hand, even that could be hidden Kabbalistic reasoning?
Okay, so this is very interesting. Yeah, there's a clear physical reason, but then you have to ask, why was he physically constructed that way? And that's where the Kabbalistic reason would come from. Why was he left-handed in that sense? But it's not simplistic, it's not one-sided. For example, the destruction of Sodom, when it takes place, the divine name is a divine name of mercy. And then the message is, they were so criminal that even the attribute of mercy agreed that they should be destroyed. So it's not simplistic. It's not like the way in which a 6-year-old will use the concepts. Sometimes the concepts sometimes they work together, and sometimes they struggle with one another. One takes precedence over the other. And sometimes, in a certain sense, they switch roles. It's a very complex picture. But that's the difference between right and left, and it's carried out in halacha that way, and certainly carried out in Jewish thought that way. So it's quite right that there's a difference there. What it would be in those particular cases, I haven't studied them, so I can't say in detail. Yeah.
So this is probably a little bit a weird one, but I was like on Shabbos, I kind of woke up and like my arm is injured, as you've probably seen, and it has scars on it, and I was like looking at it, and I realized that the hand has like a stitching on it, or it looks like kind of a stitching, like similar to what my scars look like. And I just thought, like, well, is there any kind of reason behind why the hand has that and like not any of like the other most of the other body parts?
Let me understand you. You actually had an injury?
Yeah.
And the one result of that injury is a kind of phenomenon that looks like stitching on your hand, but not any other part of your body? That's the idea?
Well, kind of. Like, I find that the stitching on the hand that was done
Oh.
is, like, similar to the actual hand on itself. Like,
You mean the lines that
the
palms
lines
have?
in the palms.
palm
yeah,
lines.
palm lines.
The stitching that was, in other words, you're talking now about the fact that the injury followed the lines on your hand? Is that the idea?
Somewhat, yeah.
I say, okay, I'm trying to climb onto the idea.
Right.
Climb onto the idea. I'll tell you, I've wrestled with this in a general sense. And I'm of divided mind. I haven't been able to settle it. Does every fact have some significance? Or are there certain things which just are consequences of other things, but they don't have their own independent significance? You have a Sefer Torah scroll. You have all these letters. Now imagine you open it up wide, and you say, what's the exact different distance between this letter and that letter? Well, let's see, the exact in inches, in millimeters. Well, choose a unit. All the units, all the different numbers. Is the fact that this is 1,172, 4,293, and every pair. Do all those facts have significance? Now, God has infinite capacity. So there's no reason why he's going to be overwhelmed with the information. But the question is whether it has to have significance. Sometimes, the way we look at the world, sometimes, this had to happen and this had to happen, and they happened exactly 2,944 seconds apart. Well, they both had to happen, but is there any significance in the 2,944? That number of seconds apart? And then how about nanoseconds? It's a bigger number. You go on and on like that, or you simply say, look, they had to happen, and as a result of their happening, they were this far apart, but that in itself has no particular significance. My instinct tells me that there are going to be things that don't have significance, but I can't prove it. And it's certainly not because God couldn't make them all significant. It's just I don't see any point in it. I don't see that the world, a necessity for the details of the world to work out that way. It's a little bit like, maybe now I'm thinking there's a connection here. It's Hashem, we're in the final stages of editing the final manuscript of the book that my Rabbi and I are putting out about individual providence. And the Rambam, along with others, but the Rambam in particular writes that only human beings have individual providence. The species of other animals don't have individual providence, let alone trees and stones. But when we talk about individual providence, there's a systematic ambiguity in those words, and in different places they mean different things. Even the same author, in different places they mean different things. And roughly, I'm giving you now about 30 pages worth of stuff in the book. Roughly, the differences between whether there is a decision to make this happen versus whether there's an individual purpose in the decision of making this happen, or whether making this happen is for the sake of something else. The thesis of our book is that God makes everything happen, and he sets it up so that each thing will happen the way it does. But when you ask why it happens, only some things are made to happen because they're important, and other things are made to happen because they're a means to something else. And for all God's purposes matter, it didn't have to happen that way. It could have happened another way. It's just that in controlling the world, you have to decide how things will work, and this is the way it happened to work. So, for example, if a human being suffers a pain, says the Rambam, that's always corresponding to some failure that he did. Always. If there's any pleasure, that's always because he did something good, and that's why the pleasure came. One by one, individual. Each person's pleasures and pains are measured against their performance. Now, let's say there's a fish in a stream and there's a fly on the water, and the fish catches the fly and eats the fly and thereby is nourished. Well, the purpose there is that there should be fish and there should be flies. The constancy of species or types of organisms is something which divine providence cares about. But for the purpose of constancy of types, it didn't have to be that this fish would eat this fly. This fish could have eaten a different fly. Or this fish could have died and another fish could have eaten that fly and thereby maintained the species. Yes, God's control of the world made it happen that this fish would eat this fly. It wasn't an accident. It wasn't random. It didn't happen by itself. God doesn't go on vacation. But if you ask, why is it that the divine providence made this fish eat this fly? The answer is not that this fish had to eat this fly, but it's part of a program of keeping fish alive and keeping flies alive. And God could have done it for all the purposes he has. Could have been a different fish and a different fly, wouldn't have mattered. So that's a little bit of an example. I'm thinking now, you see, it's wonderful when people ask questions. You read things up that you've thought about 100 times. Maybe this is a bit of evidence on the side of the fact that certain facts don't have any intrinsic significance. I'm glad I thought of it before the book is published. It'd be embarrassing to have somebody read the book and say, "Hey, look, you wrote this over here." Doesn't that imply that? So I think that maybe that's the fact that not every particular fact has to have significance in and of itself. In your case, it could be that you'll find that because you were triggered to think about it, that will trigger you to think about other things, and you'll come to certain conclusions, or be driven. Your thoughts will be driven in a certain direction, which will be a benefit for you. So it wasn't the intrinsic thought. Again, it was something that it triggered in the future. That's what I would say. Yeah.
I was wondering, something I'm confused a little bit about is just the idea of like time, and then there's, I guess we live in a world of time, but there's also like God exists beyond time. So like sometimes I get confused about the correlation between like free will or like fate, like how much is in our control, or like how much is we're like kind of just like going along with God's plan, or like it's like a kind of thing, or
Well, there are a number of ways of sort of taking your words and attaching them to a specific problem. One is the problem of God's knowledge of what we do. In particular, if he has knowledge before we do it, do we really have free will? That's called a problem of foreknowledge and free will. That's one way to attack it. And that's discussed in the literature, and there are two different ways to handle that. I'll give you one. This is all recorded. You can get on, but I'll give you one just to show you that there's something. When you work it out in detail a little bit, then there's a way to handle that very directly. So here's the way the problem is put by Maimonides and others, and the modern philosophers, after thrashing around for a couple of decades in the early 20th century, came to the same way of formulating it. If they had read Maimonides, it would have saved them 20 years, but okay. Here I am making a free decision. Shall I lift my hand or shall I not? When I go through this, sometimes I do and sometimes I don't. I make my own decision. And then I decide, 3, 2, 1, up! Okay, I decided up. I could have decided down, so up to me. I'm capable of doing both of them, and I have to decide up. It went up because I decided. That's the way it feels to me. Now, the clever critic says, wait a minute, Rabbi, do you believe that God is all-knowing? Yeah. How about yesterday? Was he all-knowing yesterday also? Of course. Well, did he know yesterday that today you were going to lift your hand at that moment? Yeah, sure. Then the critic says, well, Rabbi, if he knew yesterday that you were going to lift your hand at that moment, could you really have kept it down? Wouldn't keeping it down mean to contradict the knowledge he had yesterday? Do you really have the power to contradict God's knowledge? Isn't God's knowledge perfect, absolute, necessary? Did you really have the power to keep it down? So I think about that. I say, yeah, that's interesting. Could I have kept it down? Doesn't sound right. I mean, if I kept it down, it would contradict God's knowledge. That doesn't seem like it's in my power to do that. Maybe you're right. Maybe I really didn't have the power to keep it down. So the critic says, well then, why did you think that you were choosing between two possibilities, two alternatives that were both in your power? You now see that the alternative that you didn't take wasn't in your power. It wasn't possible. So if you think of free will as choosing between two, both of which are in your power, and your choice makes it happen, there's something wrong with the way you think. That's not correct. If God really knew yesterday what I'm going to do today, then I'm not really choosing between two different possibilities. At this point, I begin to get nervous, what about that? And how do I defend free will, and so forth and so on. That's the way in which the problem is articulated. Now, given that way of expressing the problem, by the way, that means that the problem of God's knowledge is not that his knowledge makes me do what I do, causes me, pushes me around, gives me a shove, and I'm not moving on my own. That's not the problem. The problem is not with how I do what I do. The problem is, what about what I didn't do? Was that really possible? Was that really alternative? Was that really open? Was I really choosing between two? This does nothing about how I do what I do. It's just he's not choosing between two possibilities because one of them turns out not to be possible. Now, there is a direct answer to this question. Some reject the answer for other reasons. Go on. I'm not going to do that today, but there is a direct answer to this question. Let's play it out once more in a little more detail, and I'll show you where the critic here is making an assumption which we could deny. So, in the real world, this is what happens. In the real world, I raise my hand. In the real world, God knew yesterday I was going to raise my hand. That's the real history. Now, the critic asks a question not about the real world. He asks a question about a virtual world. What about a world in which you would keep your hand down instead of raising? So he's asking me to think about something that didn't happen, because I really did pick it up. But think about another world in which you keep it down. Is that world a possible world? Could there be a world like that? Is that a possible scenario? Well, let's think about it. He says, well, listen, God knows that you're going to raise it up. Does he? Wait a minute. We're not talking about the real world anymore. We're talking about another world that never was true, that never happened. You're asking whether this other scenario is possible. So when you talk about the other scenario in which I keep my hand down instead of raising it up, why do you import into that scenario also that yesterday God knew it was going to go up? Who told you to put that in? Maybe the correct answer is this. In the real world, I raised it, and he knew that I was going to raise it. In that scenario where you imagine that I keep it down, in that scenario, he knows that I'm going to keep it down. And that's why it's possible, because his knowledge is different in that scenario. What the critic is doing is assuming that the knowledge in the real world should apply also to the false scenario that didn't happen. Stick it in, and then you see that you have a problem. Who says I should stick it in? Now, that's a little bit too abstract. Let me put it the way Bertrand Russell put it. Bertrand Russell, who was no friend of ours, who was a self-proclaimed atheist, but he himself wrote about this problem. Don't use this problem to beat up the religious believer, because it's just a mistake. God knew yesterday what I'm going to do today. How does he know? What do you mean, how does he know? He's God, everything's possible for him. Yeah, okay, I hear that, but how does he know? Here's one possibility, one scenario for God. Yesterday, God takes a look at what's going to happen for his tomorrow, which is today. He's going to take a look into his future. Nobody can see the future. Yeah, but God can, okay? God has powers that we don't have. So he, from yesterday, looks into the future, 24 hours later, and he sees Gottleib and says, he's making these stupid remarks in this lecture. Okay, let's watch him and see what happens. And he sees that I lift my hand, and that's how yesterday, he knew yesterday what I'm going to do today, because yesterday he saw me doing it today. Well, if he gets his knowledge from what I do, then in the real world, where I really lift my hand up, the day before, he knows I'm going to lift it up because he sees me lifting it up. In the virtual world, the non-existent world, the one we're checking its possibility, where I keep my hand down, then in that world, 24 hours before, he observes me keeping it down. So in that world, he'll know it's going to be down. And then you have two perfectly consistent pictures. The picture of the real world, I picked it up and he was going to pick it up. The picture of the virtual world, the false scenario, I really keep it down, and he knows I'm going to keep it down, and both are perfectly consistent. There's no reason why it's not possible for me to keep it down. That's a way of solving the problem so that there's no inconsistency, there's no impossibility. Where he claims that what I didn't do is impossible, wasn't really an alternative, wasn't really choosing between two possibilities, it's not correct. So that's one way to avoid one of the problems that's in the words that you said, is one of the problems. And other similar ones, God being timeless, gets the same solution in a certain sense. That's discussed as well. And fate, which is a different problem, because fate is what God makes happen. And we've been talking only now about what God knows. Those are two separate problems. That also this is a well-discussed area of Jewish philosophy. So I'm just giving you an example of one of the applications. Yeah.
Rob, okay, I hope I formulate this correctly, but when we look at like the grand scope, like how many people there are in the world, and we believe as Jews that perhaps our purpose stems from learning Torah, what is like our perspective meant to be on what everyone else is doing with their lives?
Well, first of all, I'm not going to agree to that formulation of the purpose of our lives.
Well, I think it's like it stems from something higher than ourselves. So like a Torah,
Yes, but you're speaking out of a certain culture, out of a certain standard vocabulary, which I think gives an overly narrow and therefore very misleading picture of what the life of a Jew is. The life of a Jew is not learning Torah. God gave us 613 commandments, and learning Torah is one of them. The life that he wants you to lead is to fulfill all of them to the best of your ability, with priorities and with hierarchies and so forth and so on. But he also wants you to bench after meals and give charity and pursue justice and all the rest. And that's so. Talk about just learning Torah is a kind of prejudice of a certain circle, and I'm not going to acquiesce in that prejudice. Okay, but now you have the difference between the things that are a purpose and the things that are a means to the purpose. So, the Rambam in Hilchos Deos and the Ramchal in the Derech Hashem define service of God as follows. What does it mean to serve God? Well, it means either to do mitzvos, things that he told you to do, or to do what is necessary to be able to do mitzvos. That's like sleep and eating, and this one's tricky and it's controversial in some areas, but I will speak it out. Getting a job, getting a job might be part of what you need to do in order, I'm not allowed to talk about that, but it's one rule that I break, and so forth and so on. So now, all of it is serving God. So serving God is 24/7, 365. There's no time off from serving God. But playing doubles tennis might also be serving God. It's a means to a certain Yeshivat Ohr, a certain balanced mental state, and so forth and so on. Okay, so maybe other people are playing the role of providing the means for a Jew to be able to perform his mitzvos. And when the Mashiach comes, according to almost everyone, the non-Jewish world will remain non-Jews. They will not become Jews. That doesn't mean their lives won't be significant. They'll be enabling Jews to be able to perform mitzvos. This, according to Gemara and Avodah Zarah, is what the non-Jews will claim when the Mashiach comes. Oh, we have arranged the economic world and we built roads and so forth and so on, just for the Jews to be able to do the mitzvos that you wanted them to do. And if that were true, that would be a justification for their lives. So their lives don't have to be justified by doing mitzvos. Their lives can be justified by making conditions under which mitzvos can be done. They also have their own mitzvos, right? They have their own 65 mitzvos or so that they're supposed to do. That would be. But you see, if you set it up as learning Torah and they're not going to be learning Torah, then you've already prejudiced the issue.
But then, what would their motivation or goal be for that? I mean, for us, ultimately, we strive to connect to Hashem in the sense of a greater...
So I'll tell you, this is very important. The Rambam has a very strong remark here. He says that a non-Jew gets credit for the mitzvahs that he does only if he does them because God commanded them through Moses. He's got to believe in the revelation at Sinai, and he has to believe that God commanded them through Moses, and that's why he's doing them. The motivation is part of their responsibility. So if a non-Jew is just motivated to give charity or motivated to pursue justice because he feels like it, according to Rambam, he won't get credit for that. It has to be, it's really built into the language. You're fulfilling a commandment, and you don't believe in the commander? What does that mean? It's like they make this joke about the Israeli army because we have so many different national groups here, and they speak different native languages, and their pronunciation of Hebrew can be very different from one another. So the commanding officer from Ethiopia says to the officer under his, soldier under his command, who's from Russia, shut the door. And the soldier of Russia doesn't understand what he's talking about, doesn't get the words whatsoever, but he's cold. So he goes over and shuts the door. He didn't fulfill the command. He did what the command said, but he didn't fulfill the command. He didn't even know it was a command. He had no clue that it was a command. That's not going to do it. So that is something that would be necessary. Yeah.
So does that mean that, what about a Christian person who believes in Moshe, but is also serving for whatever they serve for?
So it's very tricky. The Rambam talks about this in the guide. Let's take a string of examples. Let's take someone who thinks that Joe Biden happens to know ancient Greek. Well, he doesn't. Okay, made a mistake about Joe Biden. Huh? Suppose he thinks that Joe Biden is really 3 different people taking turns. There's no one person named Joe Biden. Well, that's worse. Maybe now you think, he's not talking about anything, because there aren't 3 people who are taking turns making appearances under Joe Biden's name. So if that's what he thinks, he's not in touch with the reality at all. When he thinks that Joe Biden speaks Greek, Joe Biden's a person, and he can identify him and so forth and so on, just making a mistake about Joe Biden. But when the mistake gets too big, then it's not about that thing at all anymore. It's about nothing. It's just about something which doesn't exist at all. So now, let me ask you, what do you think about average Jews or even well-educated Jews? Do you think that they have any false beliefs about the Creator? Any? I'd imagine they do. Thinking about the Creator is hard, and there's a big literature on it. Most people haven't read much of it, but innocently, they're making mistakes, thinking about what the Creator is, or what He wants to do, and what His purposes are. So, does that mean that somehow their mitzvos aren't mitzvos, and they're disconnected, and they're living in a world of unreality? No, they're making a mistake about the Creator. Now, this is a matter of degree. So, someone who thinks that the world is run at base by a plurality of 22 different deities, he's off. He hasn't got it at all. Someone who thinks that there is a Creator, but then there are beings under him who, this is called shituf, who being under him who have some independent decision-making capacity, but he's the only creator. This is wrong, and it's called avodah zarah strictly for a Jew anyway. For a non-Jew, it's controversial whether it is or it isn't. But to say that you're not connecting to the creator of the world at all seems to be a little exaggerated. So now you talk about Christians. I once made a remark in a shir here that there are hundreds of different Christian sects with different beliefs. And one of the boys said, "No, Rabbi, you're wrong." I said, "Really?" He said, "Yeah, there are over 1,000. I said, okay, gotcha. It's perfectly all right. I don't mind. Multiply them at will. Right? So you talk about Christians.
Yeah.
There's a gigantic variety of belief among them. And some have nothing associated with the Creator, and some have some things created. How they're associated in 3 and 1, and 1 and 3. The Ramban was forced to have a debate with a non-Jewish. Sorry, let me say it again. A Jew who had become a Christian priest about the Talmud and about Jewish belief and so forth and so on. And after 3 days, and the king of Aragon, who arranged this, was a friend of the Ramban. But the church was breathing down his neck. So he asked the Ramban, look, I can't help it. You have to do this for me. So he sat there for 3 days, and it's all written up. The Ramban wrote it up afterwards. You can read it. It's published. After 3 days of answering their questions, the Ramban says, I've been answering a question for 3 days. Is it okay if I ask a question? So, so the king said, well, I'll tell you, that's the priest. And they said, yeah, he can ask a question. So the Ramban said, look, you guys believe in 3 and 1. 3 is 1 and 1 is 3. What is that? How does that work? It's like 3 peas in a pod? No. 3 qualities in one object? No. So after a few examples, they keep saying no. Ramban said, you tell me. What do you mean when you say that you have 3 and you have 1? And they said, this Pablo Christiani said, we don't understand it, we just believe it. To which the Ramban said, if you don't understand it, you can't believe it. You don't understand it, you can't believe it. So when you talk about they're believing certain types of things, now actually the Ramban took this idea from the Rambam. Even Rabbi Chevelle in his edition of the Ramban doesn't bring it, but in part 1, chapter 50 of the guide, the Rambam talks about 3 and 1, and because he's talking about God's attributes, and he wants to say that maybe it should be like the Christians, and he says, listen, some people are concerned about knowing what to say. Knowing what to say. You're taught a mantra, and you know what words to repeat, and that gets you your social acceptance and opens doors for you and so forth and so on. And they don't care whether there's a meaning behind it or not. They just say the words, like the Christians who say God is 3 and God is 1 and 1 is 3 and 3 is 1, right? You can speak the words, but there's no thought behind them because there's just an open contradiction. And he said a Jew who will say that various attributes are many in us, but one in God is just as bad as a Christian. He's talking nonsense. He's just saying something that has. So when you talk about their having different beliefs, you have to be very careful whether they really have a belief or whether they just know the words to say. Pablo Christianity was telling us he doesn't have a belief because a belief is a meaning. It's a thought. It's an idea in the mind. Reciting syllables doesn't mean you have a thought in the mind. And if the syllables express a direct contradiction, there isn't any thought in the mind. So he was admitting that he doesn't have a thought in his mind. He just knows what words to say. Then you can't say that they have beliefs. A belief is a thought in the mind. It's not just words that you pronounce. So they don't have that. So it's very tricky to talk about what the beliefs are and how to define what the beliefs are and so forth and so on. And there are so many variations. I could imagine that some are so extreme that you would want to say that the idea of God has been lost, and others would be mistakes, but not such serious mistakes. We want to say that belief in God, the fact that you're talking about God has not been lost. I think it would vary from case to case. Yeah.
So my question, I guess, is in regards to like language, and my current perspective of language is that it's very subjective, I guess. Like you could say one thing and someone understands something completely different. So I guess, how do I know that, like, say, for God's mitzvos and commandments, like that I am fulfilling what He intended for us to do, and like I guess also like, is there a certain like power or like message associated with words, or is it only the meaning we apply to it? Like, does it have like a meaning outside of us?
It sounds like you've been affected by postmodernism. I would suggest to you that postmodernism is greatly exaggerated, both its value and its coherence and its applicability. Here, I'll give you an example, okay? I write up a contract with somebody, and my part of the contract is, on the 15th of every month, I will deliver to this person $10,000 in cash. I walk in with a box on the 15th, right? 15th of July, I walk in with a box, and he opens the box, and it's filled with 10,000 Monopoly dollars. And he says, where's my money? And I say, there it is, right on the table. There they are. He says, but this is play money. This isn't real. Look, it says in the contract, dollars. These are Monopoly dollars. So it's all right. Is this a serious disagreement? Is it really true that in the contract it could be read two ways, and who knows what the meaning is, and maybe it depends on the context like the president of Harvard said, yeah, calling for genocide of Jews might or might not violate our rules, depends upon the context, right? No, it's not really true that anything can mean anything, and people have their own meanings, and no meanings are acceptable, are rejected, and no means are inappropriate. It's just not correct. Dear John, I never want to see you again. What they call the Dear John letter. And he's crying his eyes out, and his friend says, you don't understand. Dear John means I'm writing to you from the supermarket, and I want to know whether I should buy cereal. And I never means I want this particular cereal. And again means, should I buy 2 boxes? That's all. What are you worried about? No. Sorry. She's rejecting him, and he's lost it, and he's crying because that's the fact. Don't tell me that the text can mean whatever you want. That's absolute nonsense. So there are variations sometimes in the meaning of a text. And then when there are different ways to read a text, maybe the truth is that the text can be read both ways. You don't have to assume that it's one or the other, and at least one of them is wrong. Maybe both are wrong. No, maybe both are right. You know, Robert Frost wrote a poem called Mending Wall. In the springtime, when the wall's been broken by winter forces and so forth and so on, the 2 farmers, one on each side, go down the wall together, and they fix the wall. He says, he's growing peas, and I'm growing carrots. Neither of us has sheep to eat the other guys. What are we doing with a wall? Do we really need a wall? Yeah, but it's springtime, and that's what we do, mending wall. Fine. He wrote this poem. Somebody asked him later in life, maybe that was a parable for international relations with borders, and whether it should and should not, and so on. Is that what you meant? And he said, no, I meant mending walls in the springtime in New England. But maybe the poem could mean that. Maybe it could mean that. And then wouldn't mean that one's right and one's wrong. I don't believe anyway that the meaning of a literature is what's in the mind of the writer. Because in fact, the words might not express what's in his mind. What he produces for the world is a book. He doesn't produce his mind for the world. And interviewing him later might not even be the best way to interpret what he wrote. But that doesn't mean the words don't have any meaning. They definitely do have meaning. And for every meaning they can have, there's an infinity of meanings they can't have. They're ruled out. So the language isn't infinitely flexible like that. And therefore, when so to speak, the HaKadosh Baruch Hu dictated a book for us, he dictated for a book in our language, and he expects that we will be able to understand it. So, for example, you have people say, good. Who knows what good is for God? We have some idea of what good is for us, but who knows what good is for God? If you really take that seriously, when he says to you, do good, you get nothing out of it because you don't know what he means. No, he wrote the book for me. So he put it in my language. I don't have to know what he means. I have to know what he wants me to mean. I have to know what he wants me to understand. And he wrote it for me in my language. And although there are tricky questions about good, there are also lots and lots of cases that aren't tricky. Torturing small children for fun isn't a tricky case. That's a case where it's definitely bad. Right? If you don't get that, then you haven't got the concept at all. So I think this worry that language doesn't really mean anything, if you twist it any way you like, and you could apply it as you please, is simply not correct. And the people at Yale who founded postmodernism, some of them turned out to be renegade Nazis. And there was literary evidence against them. So maybe there was a thought there, if the literary documents don't really mean anything, then you can't accuse me because all you got for me is literature, and therefore it doesn't mean anything, and therefore, it was really, it's just like much of the modern nihilism and antinomianism that you find, especially in the college world, it just doesn't hold water. Doesn't hold water at all, yeah.
I have a similar question, but not really.
Am I supposed to take that seriously? Yes, but no? Okay, fire away.
So we believe that Hashem spoke the world into existence in the Hebrew language, or the Hebrew alphabet. But I've seen like archaeological findings of like a Proto-Hebrew and sort of like the evolution of some of the letters or the glyphs over time, like that wasn't their quote unquote original form that's been found in writings, like a I don't know if that makes sense, or if is there some was there ever some evolution on the human side at least to get to the Hebrew alphabet that we have now?
Well, yes, our sources talk about that. We know about that. In fact, when we came back from the Babylonian exile, a lot of things changed, and one thing that changed was the alphabet. But I think it's Maral who explains as follows, that both alphabets were always in use, but they had different uses. You know, I think it's in Arabic, they have like literary Arabic and ordinary pedestrian spoken Arabic. Similarly, there was an alphabet. When you said alphabet, you meant the shapes of the letters.
Yes,
I didn't catch that till the end. There was one set of shapes that were used for holy writings, and the other set of shapes that were not used for holy writings. Now, and that changed when they came back from the Babylonian exile. So we know there was a change. That's not news to us. But it wasn't an accident that there was a change. And both alphabets, since they were both ancient, both alphabets have their connection to reality. They're not arbitrary. They're not just conventional. How to separate them out and how to separate them out in time, I don't know in detail. I never studied that in detail. But what the archaeologists, and of course, I don't know if the archaeologists have really found what we're talking about. But the idea that the shapes of our letters change, we do know. It's in our literature. Okay. So you could follow that. Yeah.
Rob, maybe to spring forward off that question about the languages, a little bit different though, but are we somewhat capable of understanding objective morality, what actually makes something good versus evil? I mean, like, obviously, we can understand in our modern sense, like, maybe perhaps it benefits society or not, but are we truly able to understand the essence, what is good and what is wrong?
Well, the word understanding is a little flexible. For example, suppose in every case you got right what was good and what was not. When somebody asked you for a definition, you weren't able to get it. You weren't able to give the definition in words. Would that be called understanding, or would it not be called understanding? Let me give you a far example, and then maybe a closer example. I had a friend still in this world. He worked at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, where they make satellites and bombs and smart bombs and things like that. And he told me that in the United States Navy, they had a problem. When you're in a submarine, and you're using a sonar scope to observe the waters in front of you, so you send out sound waves, and you get the sound waves reflected back, and they make a pattern. And on the basis of the pattern, you have to judge what it is that it's mounting against. And there's certain schools of fish which give a pattern very similar to the pattern of an enemy submarine. Now, you don't want to use your torpedoes on fish, do you? No. So it's very important to be able to tell which is which. There were two people in the Navy who, looking at the sonar scope, could reliably tell you whether it was fish or a submarine. And then one died. So down to one. And they had this problem. So I said, I suppose the Navy figured out the strategy of asking them to tell them what the difference is. Yeah, actually, some geniuses in the Navy thought that out. And they asked them, and here's what they said. Well, the fish look like fish, and the submarines look like submarines. I mean, they just look different. To them, they look different. Not to anybody else. They couldn't see it. And to them, it just looked different, right? Do they know the difference? Well, they get it right every time. So I guess they do know it, but they can't put it into words. So the fact that I can't put it into words doesn't mean that I don't know it. So now, if people get right what's good and what's not good, that means there's some kind of knowledge there, especially if people agree on it. If people discuss tricky cases and come to conclusions, that definitely means there is some knowledge there, even if it can't be put into words. And indeed, you don't want to demand for knowledge that you give it a definition, do you? Because then, how would you end the chain? What does P mean? P means QRS. Okay, what does Q mean? Oh, Q means XY. What does X and Y mean? Right? There's got to be a stop for this somewhere, because only have a finite number of words. You can't define everything in terms of something else. So there's got to be some things you understand without giving the understanding in other words in a definition. This game of of asking for definitions has got to stop somewhere. And therefore, when you're in having a discussion and the sophomore who's taken 6 months of philosophy thinks he's very clever and he says, define your terms. Often the right thing to do is say, no, I don't have to. Because our usages are so common, it's clear that we have a concept in common. And if I can't give you a verbal definition, that doesn't mean I don't understand it. It's just a mistake. That's why he's only taken 6 months as philosophy. If you'd taken 3 years, you'd have known better than to demand a definition for everything. So the question is then, how much knowledge do we have and how much agreement do we have? And here in the literature, for certain political reasons, there's a tremendous emphasis on the difficult cases, the cases where there's a lot of controversy. And then when people want to say, see, you don't even know whether that's right or that's wrong or this is better or that's worse. Yeah, there are hard cases, but there are also simple cases, lots of them. For example, most of the hard cases are where you're pitting two moral conditions against one another. Is it right to tax the rich in order to service the poor against the will of the rich? You're violating their property rights in order to help somebody else with the needs that they have. So it's one against the other. So, of course, that's, not say of course, but that's a difficult question. But take one-dimensional questions. Judith Jarvis Thompson, who was a wonderful philosopher, I think she was Jewish also, made this point. Ask, I've made a promise to do X. I have two alternatives. In one, I fulfill X, and one I do not. There's no other difference between them. No other morally relevant difference between them. The only thing is, in the one I fulfill the promise, the one I don't. What should I do? Is this controversial? Is this tricky? Do you have a variety of points of view? Should we flip a coin? Obviously, if there's no other difference, then you do the one that fulfills the promise. And if this one causes pain and this one doesn't cause pain. And you can go on. Each moral condition, when taken by itself, is something which people recognize. And if I say, this one pleases the chief and this one doesn't, you say, yeah, but so what? I mean, why is pleasing the chief relevant? Because it's not a moral condition. So there's a gigantic amount of agreement on what kinds of conditions are moral and what kinds of conditions aren't moral.
But what's the basis of making something moral or not?
Why must there be a basis? This is the same problem as before. In order to accept P, I got to back it up with Q. And because to accept Q, I got to back it up with R. Can I always ask, what's the basis?
It's like innately. Do we just not have like some moral call?
But I'm pointing out to you that you can't avoid this. You can't avoid this. You can't have as a principle, I don't accept P unless something backs it up. Because if you say that, you're going on an endless chase. If you're going to know anything at all, there has to be some things that you just know. For example, 2 + 2 is 4. Back it up. That's as strong as you get. There's nothing else that could give it a little more oomph, a little more push, a little more seriousness than 2 + 2 is 4. That's a starting point in our thought. There's more to be said about this. That doesn't mean we have to be right. It's not infallible, and so forth and so on. But not everything has to be backed up, because if that were true, you wouldn't know anything, because everything would need to be backed up, and you'd be off on an infinite chase. These things are not so simple. This is what what's the fellow at Princeton called reasoning. He had a book called Reasoning. How one reasons, what the rules are for reasoning. It's not simple. Yeah.
When Mashiach comes, would theoretically he have the free will that would allow society to regress again? Like,
You don't mean he, you mean everybody.
Either he or everybody.
Yes, there is the free will, but it could be something like, do you have the free will to put your hand in the fire? I mean, you do, but it's quite clear from the kind of person that you are and what your priorities are that you're not going to do it. That doesn't mean it's not free. What I know about you is the kinds of free choices you make. And I know the reasons for which you make them. That doesn't mean they're not free. They are free, but you're also reliable that you're not going to do otherwise. Yeah, in the back.
How does the Rambam's statement that if you don't understand something, you can't believe in it affect our religion?
Oh, very good. I'm glad you asked that. I was waiting for somebody to ask that. Actually, you could ask it stronger. What do you mean? Aren't there lots of things we believe that we don't understand? like the creation of the world. We don't understand that. Well, there are different kinds of lack of understanding. I'll give you at least three. You can fail to understand how it happens, you can fail to understand why it happens, or you can fail to understand what happened. So, if somebody says, I let go of the stone and it didn't fall, I don't know what to say. I can't explain it. It just didn't fall. So, I know what happened. The stone was hanging in the air. I just don't know why or how, what caused it to happen that way. That's no problem. You can believe that the stone it was hanging in the air without knowing why or how it was hanging in the air. That's different from someone who says, you're going to the mall? Yes. I want you to do me a favor. While you're there, could you please pick up for me a square circle? Say that again. Please pick up a square circle. I think you would say, I'm sorry, I don't know what you mean. I mean, I can't. Square, circle, but I can't get, I don't understand how to get something that's both a square and a circle. I don't understand what you're asking for. I don't understand what you mean. That's where you can't have a belief. You can't have a belief when the words that you use to describe the belief are a contradiction, because there, the belief has no content. That's what he meant, and that's what he was talking about. So you say it's 3 and 1 is 3 and 3 is 1, that's gibberish. That's Gobbledygook. 1 can't be 3 and 3 can't be 1, as far as I know, as far as I can understand. Maybe you mean something that I never thought of, but then teach me. Don't just say those words to me. Because if all I have is those words, I have no concept whatsoever. A belief is based on a concept, an idea, an understanding, and I have no understanding. That's what he meant. If you can't understand what is being said, then you can't have a belief. But if you don't understand how something happens or why something happens, you can certainly have a belief that it is so. We don't understand how God created the world, and both the Maimonides says that as a philosopher, and the Kabbalists say that as Kabbalists, this idea that there are two great realms, warring realms, sects, the philosophers and the Kabbalists is absolute nonsense. Absolute nonsense. And this is one of the many things that they agree upon. Both the Rambam and the Ramchal say, on creating the world is something. We know the world is supported by the Creator, and without the Creator's support, it would cease to exist. But what the Creator is and how He has the access to make the world exist, that we don't know. So we know that it's so, but we don't know how and why it's so. Well, the purpose for it, we do know. That's part of the why. Yeah.
In terms of it's a very different question, but in terms of the woke world we've been exposed to,
Yeah.
in a sense, my understanding of it, that if you feel some way innately, you have a justification of acting out on that. So, like a brief example, like the male feeling as if you should transition to a woman. Torah clearly forbids that, but how are we meant to view that within them? Is it perhaps a mental disease, or
I think you dignify it by making it a mental disease.
or is it
That would mean that they have no choice. The whole system is so childish. And maybe that's an insult to the children. It's so childish and it's so rife with contradiction. You know what I feel like? You know what I really feel like? I feel like defending Israel. I feel like defending against his enemy. So it's right for me to do that, right? It's okay for me to do that. It's my expression of myself in life. Is that okay? Oh no, not that. Just some feelings, but not other feelings, right? I'm worried and disturbed and frightened by. I'm a woman. I'm disturbed by the trans man using my facilities. You can't have that feeling. You're not allowed to have that feeling. If you have that feeling, then you're evil. And we have to disregard your feeling. Only the feeling of the trans person counts, not the person who's disturbed by the trans person. Why is that? Give me a break. Dignifying it as if there were really principles there and so forth and so on. I identify as. Right? So they asked this. I saw a guy who did interviews. A white guy. What about a white guy who identifies as black? He identifies as black. If there are going to be remunerations for all the suffering and everything else, he should get a check also, no? No, you can't identify as black. Why not? Why not? How can a man identify as a woman? Isn't that something like he isn't? So if that's true, then how can't you? No, that you're not allowed to do. Well, you know about the furries? Okay, he identifies as a bear. Right? What's wrong with that? Don't tell me to pay taxes. I'm a bear. I don't have to walk across the walk on the crosswalk. I'm a bear. I can walk wherever I want. Right? Is that okay? What about I'm a rock? Don't move. I'm a stone. This dignifying this as if it were principles and thoughts and rules and true and false and so on and so on. It's like.
Sorry, what I meant to question more of is perhaps say these people have some urge within them to make them say these things. I'm not sure what it is, but from the Torah perspective, we just view that as like a Yeshivat Ohr, or is there actually something wrong with these people? Like what? Like it's not like a drug addict. It's like you see they have an urge.
I'll tell you. I think I'll give you the final example. When I was in teaching university, there were two thoughts that undergraduates had very popularly. One is that there are no objective rules of morality. Different people have different values, different priorities, and you can't tell one group, especially different cultures, multiculturalism and all the rest, can't tell them what's right and wrong. You're just projecting your culture onto them, and that's imperialistic. You're not allowed to do that. That was one thought. And the other thought was when, for example, professors would fail students, they would penalize students, and they would say, "You can't do that to me. You're infringing on my rights. I have rights too. I'm a student, I'm a human being, and I have rights." Now let's see, can we put those two thoughts together? You can't violate my rights, but no rights and wrongs are real. None of them are objective. It's real relative to the society, the person, the individual, and so on and so on. Those don't really go together, do they? But they do psychologically. The psychological theme of both of them is, get off my back. Get off my back. So if you tell me that what I'm doing is wrong, I say right and wrong are relative, they're not absolute. No one has a real rule of what's right and wrong. Don't tell me what to do. But if you deprive me of something that I want, then I say, you're infringing on my rights. And you can't do that because I have rights. Right? Both of them have the same psychological theme, get off my back. The fact that intellectually they're inconsistent doesn't bother them because they're interested. Here's where the real sickness is. My feelings are what really count. My feelings are my reality, and you have to respect my feelings. Even though they're not consistent about that, because if I feel I want to defend Israel, they don't respect that feeling. Or if I'm disturbed by trans people, you don't respect that feeling. But then the inconsistencies is just a question of my feelings. Well, Ben Shapiro has a wonderful motto: facts don't care about your feelings. Facts don't care about your feelings. And if your feelings lead you to deny facts, goodbye. Goodbye. I have to talk to you. I have to reason with you. Reason? If feelings contradict your facts, you dismiss the facts, there's no one home to talk to. Aristotle raises this question. When you catch a person in a contradiction, that's supposed to end the argument. Suppose, he says, you catch him in a contradiction, he says, yeah, I contradicted myself. So what? What do you do then? You know what you do? Give him $10 and tell him go buy a beer. Leave me alone. If contradiction doesn't bother him, there's no one home to talk to. There's no reason there. Yeah, okay, maybe the last question because I have to go. Yeah, last question.
In Rabbi's estimation, what's the machlekes between the Hashem and the Graph?
Thanks very much. There was an ancient motto, everyone has a right to an opinion. That's passé. In America, everyone has an obligation to have an opinion. What's your opinion on X? I think that's utterly corrupt. If you haven't studied X, if you haven't read at least what the experts say about X, why should you have an opinion? What's your opinion about solo sailboating? Good, bad, dangerous, appropriate, not inappropriate? You know what I'm talking about. You know the difference between a mainsail and a jib? and the rudder, all three of which you have to control at the same time, you haven't got a clue. So, but what's your opinion, right? You're talking about a massively scholarly topic about which there are considerable differences. Of Dessler says the difference between them was a minuscule, tiny detail, and not the major philosophical difference. Other people say, okay, so it's controversial. I think the appropriate thing to do when you haven't been trained in the question is to say, I don't know. Chazal say this, Lamad l'shon chalomer eini yodea. Teach your tongue to say, I don't know. It's a very, very important lesson. Okay, with that, I'll leave you.